Welcome back to In Conversation With. Today, I had the opportunity to sit down with Ritesh Kotak, who has spent his career working on the issues of cyber safety and cybersecurity from a policing perspective and from now a legal perspective. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Hi, Ritesh.
Hello.
Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I have a lot of questions for you about all things cyber and mis and disinformation. But can you tell us just first, how did you get into this unique career that you are currently in? I imagine the path was not straight.
The path was definitely not straight. I actually grew up in a family business. My parents were in food manufacturing. In fact, my crib was in the store.
Oh my
I say it's
God.
because my parents didn't want to pay for a babysitter, but that's a whole other
I
story.
love that.
And I always was fascinated by technology, mainly because we couldn't afford technology. I remember we wanted to implement a
Wow.
point of sale system at my parents' place, and we got a quote for like $30,000. And I was like, this just doesn't seem right. I don't have
Oh.
$30,000. I got $300.
Yeah,
Right? Like, can we
exactly.
do something with that? But it was always just very hands-on and trying to just figure things out, hack away at problems.
Interesting.
And I ended up doing a degree in business, and I
Okay.
took some courses in computer science and tech-related courses because I was fascinated by it. But that was kind of always my thing. Like, I was going to take over the family business. I was going to, be a spiceologist. I used to joke around with you because my parents were in the spice business. Um, but what ended up happening was in my fourth year, a police service was actually recruiting. And I was talking to a recruiter, and he says, Ritesh, you ever thought about joining the police service? And I was like, nope. And he says, you should apply. And I applied, and I just started going through the rounds. And when I graduated, I had two offers. I had one from a financial firm to become an accountant, and I had one from the police department.
Oh, it's
And
like sliding doors or
yeah,
whatever.
it's like, which one do I take? Do I go left or do I go right? It's kind of like a matrix thing, right?
Totally.
But I remember going home and telling my mother,
Yeah.
and she hugged me and kissed me and said, I'm so proud my son's going to be an accountant. And I think I've been a disappointment ever since. But even when I got into the police service, it was always kept getting sucked into the tech stuff. And that time tech was definitely a hot button issue. Left policing to go do my MBA. I lived in
But
China.
when you went into policing,
Yeah.
what did you like? You weren't recruited as an officer. What were you recruited to do?
So I got recruited to. So what I actually got recruited to do, I couldn't do because at that time we had a new mayor in the city, and everything was there was a hiring freeze.
Oh, okay.
So there were a lot of civilian type positions that
Okay.
that opened up, and I told myself, I said, I just turned down a lucrative career on essentially Bay Street,
Yes.
and what am I? I need some jobs better than no job, and I just got sucked right into it. But very quickly, I was given opportunities. There were some senior officers that recognized what I could bring to the table, and they gave me opportunities. They pushed the boulders out of the way, which actually led to a very interesting meeting with the chief of police of the day, who's now actually Canada's defense minister, Bill Blair. And I remember being in the meeting with Bill Blair and the other deputy chiefs, and I guess Minister Blair says this story quite openly. And what it was is, I said, Chief, do you think we have a cybersecurity related issue in the organization? And he says, no. So I live hacked him.
Like right there.
Right there. I live hacked him. And that's what created the cyber crimes division in the police service. And next thing I knew, I was on a plane. I was speaking at the FBI Major City Chiefs. I was at the World Internet Conference. I was at Intersec in Dubai. And that was that TSN turning point.
Yeah.
That kind of switched everything and put me on this trajectory where I am today.
That's a fascinating story. And I think, one of the things that I've learned in working with you, but also the work that we've been doing on cyber safety with policing, so both with police and with RCMP, is just how there just seems to be an appetite for innovation and advancement. It's not something I would have thought, but within policing, people do seem to, we think of it one way, but I've been really impressed by how much goes on within the policing world related to, whether it's technology or any kind of other advancements. But so you were in policing, you were doing this work. How did you then move to the world of tech entrepreneurship, or what was I get the aha moment to getting into cyber security, what was the aha moment saying, okay, I'm going to leave policing and move into this
And
next phase?
I felt like I had a chance to do what I wanted to do. And I've always been the type of person where I want to do as many things as I can. They say life is too short, but it's also the longest thing you'll ever do.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do as many things as I possibly could. And at that moment, I said, I kind of want to go do my MBA. But I also want to do it outside of Canada. I want to travel. I really never had a chance to live anywhere else except essentially Toronto. So that's when I went to go do my MBA. I did at the University of Edinburgh in beautiful Edinburgh, Scotland, and did an exchange at Peking University in Beijing.
Amazing.
So I was fascinated by just technology around the world, very different, advanced in some cases, but you get to live it and breathe it. And then from there, I got recruited to go work at Microsoft. So I was in Redmond for a little bit, and there were a few moments in my personal life and in my professional life where I felt that there was a huge disconnect between technology and the law. I felt that tech was advancing, the law was not keeping up, and not that it needs to keep up, because I always believe that the law should be the floor and not the ceiling. But I remember being in meetings and talking to individuals, and they would say stuff about, give a legal opinion about a technology without really understanding the technology, because they weren't tech lawyers, they were criminal defense lawyers, they were civil litigators, there were intellectual property lawyers, copyright, trademark, patent lawyers. And I was like, well, what about everyday people dealing with issues related to technology? Where are they supposed to turn to? And I felt like that was my calling. And at that moment, there was actually a tragic incident that occurred. It was a homicide, and what happened was I had the victim's family. They were actually social media influencers, and they reached out because they were being bombarded with messages that were directed to them of their now deceased family member, like images, really vile stuff, and it was heartbreaking. And I remember reaching out to local attorneys, and I said, can you help this family out, please? And I got one of two answers. This is not my area of law, or sure, $5,000 retainer, please. And what really got me was when this individual said to me, Ritesh, thank you for your help, but I'm just going to deal with this because we can't afford this and no one can help us. And I was like, is this the world I want to live in? And at that moment, I went and signed up for my LSAT.
It's amazing. That is so... I love, like, and you know that we had two of Canada's astronauts here, and one of the things, Jeremy Hansen, who's going to go to the moon, so he's achieved a pretty high level in his in his career, but he was talking to kids about like finding this zone of genius, and by that he meant, like, he said every single person has one. It's like this place where you know you should be in doing work that you both like, that drives you, but that you just feel so compelled by. And so that, and so few people get to find that. And I think you have obviously found it.
Yeah, I feel blessed. I really do. And one of the things that came out of it is I had the opportunity to share my thoughts on current day affairs with mainstream media on a regular basis. And I set up a website, and on there I had a contact me form. And the amount of messages I started getting from families and individuals saying, can you please help me? I everything from small businesses reaching out and saying my social media account has been hacked, and this is problematic because now the hacked content violates a community standard, so now they're in essentially Facebook or Twitter jail. And they're kind of going through that process, but that's how they make their money, and they've been cut off, right? And there's huge economic losses.
Yes.
And what people forget is that there's human beings behind this, and they suffer, and they don't know where to turn to. And I always felt that intersection between technology, public safety, and the law is connecting those dots was the calling. And it's obviously you can't do everything, right? And I wish there was ways of replicating some of these models, but sometimes it just starts with one account at a time.
I totally agree. And so in the space that Actual works in, which is giving kids all kinds of science and technology, literacy and skills, we also do a lot of work with parents, or we have the opportunity to interact with parents and teachers. What, in your experience, what's important for them? If you were giving advice to parents and teachers about, keeping kids safe online or being good digital citizens online, what are some of the top pieces of advice that you would give?
So the thing about, or I guess the beauty about the internet is that it's not static, it's dynamic, it's continuously changing. We hear about new apps, we hear about new social platforms, we hear about new sub-communities that are being created on a daily basis. I always believe that personal usage is a precondition to comprehension. So if you're able to understand the platform, if you're actually on it, it's one thing to say, don't post this. It's another thing to actually understand what posting is. So my advice is understand the platform. You don't have to be an avid user, but understand the platform before you turn over the keys or hand over the keys and say, go drive this car now, right? That would be my number one piece of advice is understand, and the best way to understand is to actually engage and do it yourself. And I don't mean just read something, actually go and do it.
I think that's excellent advice. And just to close, I would love for you to share, you get exposed to all kinds of new emerging technology, and you certainly view it in a really unique way. What is something in emerging tech that you are particularly excited about right now?
I think the big one is obviously artificial intelligence, but for me, it's spatial computing.
Ooh.
That is the one thing I am super excited about. The ability to put on a headset and be transformed or transform a space around you. And we're seeing multiple vendors come out with their own headset and versions of it. But where it gets really exciting is the ability to do it without an internet connection. The ability to download content, immersive content on these devices where you can actually interact with it, but it's done on what we call the edge. And that is something that I'm watching very closely and I'm super excited about because it opens up a world of possibilities. Imagine being able to take these headsets and ship them anywhere in the world and you have access to, imagine taking a geography class and being able to visit a country, taking a history class and actually living through those moments, or from an education standpoint, having your own virtual tutor that is there willing to help you and can do it in multiple languages. So the preservation of language, access to education, leveraging technology, that all comes together when we take AI and pop that on these headsets and devices. And that marriage to me is one of the most exciting things that I am looking at and exploring, because that's the game changer.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today on In Conversation With. Please follow along for my next conversation with an inspiring leader in STEM.